so let's talk about legislation, and the New Zealand standard, which is based on the ICNIRP standard, which is the International Commission for Non-Ionising Radiation Protection, which is an international body which is industry funded basically. All the standards they say basically on if it doesn't cook you or burn you, this is paraphrasing it, if it doesn't cook you or burn you within 6 minutes, you're completely safe. That's what the standards are based on. Okay. In 2006, electric and magnetic fields were classed as a 2B carcinogen, which is a possible carcinogen. And in 2011, microwave radiation was classed as a 2B carcinogen. And since this has happened, the government has basically ignored this completely. All around the world, governments have just ignored the fact that this is now classed as a possible carcinogen. And Dr. Leonard Waddell, who provided most of the information, epidemiological studies that provided that information, he is very firmly convinced it should be classed as a class 1 carcinogen, which is a definite cause of cancer. And the industry is actually mounting a bit of a PR campaign to try and have that 2B classification overturned. And there's been a number of articles, both here in New Zealand and overseas, where they're saying, we know that it's all good, you know, cell phones are totally safe, let's just stop doing any testing. Okay. Russia, China and Italy, and Russia and China, countries that are not normally renowned for having very good human rights records, actually have standards that are at least 100 times less than ours. Our standard is based on the American military complex. All of the standards were originated from the US military and what they wanted to achieve. And Switzerland and Ukraine even lower. And our wonderful Ministry of Education has just published a report saying that Wi-Fi in schools is totally safe. Now I guess the rider on that is based on New Zealand standards, and the New Zealand standards are so outrageously high. When I'm testing somebody's home for microwave radiation, in a bedroom I look for less than 10 microwatts per square metre. The New Zealand standard is 10 million microwatts per square metre. Okay, so there's a massive factor of difference in there. And how long have we known that this is possibly harmful? In 1971, the US military, and this is a declassified document, this was a synopsis of all the research at that time, 1971. This is a summary of the 121 known effects of microwave radiation. I'm not going to go through them all, it's really, really extensive, but you kind of get an idea. You know, we've known that this stuff is harmful for a very, very long time. And just, you know, the kind of effects that we get. Okay, so I was talking to one of the top researchers in America, Dr. George Carlo recently. He said it's more like 18,000 studies now, and more than 6,000 of these studies connect EMF, electromagnetic fields, and EMR, electromagnetic radiation, with more than 122 biological effects. Our government still says that the weight of evidence says that there's not a problem. And I would say that the weight of evidence is really tipping, that there really is a problem, but they seem to ignore it. If you want to do some, read a very interesting study document, the Interphone study. This here, Dr. Magda Havis, her comment, Interphone study was one of the major studies that people quote out of Europe. It's hugely flawed. And if you want to see a different perspective with a lot of research, do a search for the Bioinitiative report or download and read the Bioinitiative report. There's 2 versions. It was updated this year, I think. It's about 500 pages, very, very extensive, but very, very good information. And the problem with the research is that it's predominantly tainted. Most of the research is industry funded and very strictly controlled. And these are the names of some of the researchers that have been attacked, and the way that they're attacked typically, they've found significant concern, and so the industry tries to discredit them, and they fund bloggers to put untruths on websites, spread rumours, cut their funding, and virtually all of these guys have been removed from their positions in their universities or research institutes. And the industry uses what they call a product defence strategy, and this is the strategy that was perfected by the tobacco industry in the 1920s. Helen Knowlton, if you want to do some research about this, it's really, really interesting. Hill and Knowlton came to the tobacco industry in the 1920s and said, hey, we've got a way that we can halt the government from challenging you over the dangers of cigarette smoke. And so they came up with this product defence strategy, which basically just creates doubt. If there's just a small amount of doubt, then the politicians can go, oh, there's a little bit of doubt, so we don't have to do anything. And that carried on right through until the 1990s. That's how successful that strategy was for tobacco. And this is the strategy they're now using with electro-pollution as well, quite effectively, really. And as I say, the standard-setting agencies are all industry funded, and they exclude biological effects in their standards. Another really excellent movie, Microwaves, Science and Lies. If you can get your hands on that, it is a really, really superb movie which explains a lot of the really devious things that happened around that setting of the 2B carcinogen in 2011 and many other things. Very, very good movie. There's a new report coming out soon, CNR, or whatever it is, and the as the people who have been putting this research report together, they've completely ignored a lot of the research from 2007 onwards, and you can see the ratios and the number of papers that have been published which show effect, which are being completely ignored in this, which is supposed to be now the cutting edge report that's being put to the EU Parliament. And a couple of really top researchers, or researcher, Dr. Lai, and a journalist, Blake Levitt, their comment there is outrageous to ignore any effect of EMF exposure to human health and a crime to humanity not to recommend any action to curtail the exposure. And as I said before, Leonard Waddell is calling for it to be a Group 1 carcinogen. And earlier this year, the IARC, the International Research on Cancer, or Institute of Cancer Research, which is part of the WHO, they put out this new report in 2014 talking about cancer, and they said at the moment there are 14 million cases of cancer per year worldwide, and they're expecting that to almost double to 22 million cases in the next 20 years, which is pretty scary. And 70% of that increase is going to be in Africa, Asia and Central and South America. And the interesting thing about that is that the technology that is going into those areas, they are not using wired technology. It is almost totally wired technology which is going in. And in that report they talk about the risk factor being tobacco, alcohol, obesity and physical inactivity. Well, tobacco and alcohol I think are rated as 2B carcinogens. I've never seen obesity or physical inactivity rated as a carcinogen anywhere in any research paper whatsoever. So, you know, that's the elephant in the room. Nobody's asking about electro-pollution. No mention. And the guy that presented this paper in London, I think it was Dr. Christopher Wild, or one of the two presenters, and he was actually on the standard setting committee that set or EMR as a class 2B carcinogen. And somebody there asked him what he thought about electro-pollution, and his comment was, no new evidence. And from the slide before, we see there is masses of mounting evidence that this is a serious, serious issue. Okay, the effects on us. Generally depressed immune system, sleeping problems, decreased blood circulation, and I'll show you a slide with some rouleau formation on in a minute. A reduced ability to concentrate, reason and remember, headaches, and a contact current greater than 1.8 microamps is implicated in cancer, and this is where the voltage on these laptop computers and other things that you touch are really critically important, because at high voltage the contact current would be definitely more than 18 microamps. This is dark field microscopy. My voice is getting a little bit croaky, I'm sorry. Healthy blood cells are separated and flow freely. Rouleau formation is when the blood cells clump together, and when they clump together like that, they can't travel through the veins very well. And so with that reduction in blood flow, you get loss of oxygen to the cells, and I think you can kind of see what's happening there. It's just not travelling well. And these are the diseases or or syndromes that EMF has been implicated in. It's very diverse and it's very wide. And so let's look at the human body and our human bioelectrical system. We are incredibly electric. And there are multiple electrical systems within our bodies. First is the ionic system, which is the ions. And this is where mechanistic chemical medicine, our normal medical system, they work predominantly in this area. Okay, we're looking at chemicals and drugs to treat people. We also have a digital electrical system, which is not in the nervous system, but close to the nervous system. And that's, you know, to make my hands do this, there's no way that that's just a chemical reaction that's doing this. It's an electrical impulse, it's an electrical signal. And that digital information system rides through near the nerves. And we also have an analog electrical system. And we have a positive potential at the brain and in the spinal column, and the further we get out the arms we have a negative potential, and that creates an electric field around our bodies. And the guy that discovered most of this, the digital electric field and the analog electrical field, Dr. Robert Becker, he postulated at the time that when he found this analog electric field, that we would be able to measure an electromagnetic field around our bodies. And it took 20 years until they invented a machine called a squid, which was sensitive enough to actually measure that, but absolutely we do. And we're also piezoelectric. Anybody gone to light the barbecue and you click the knob and it go click, 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 and then the flame starts? Okay, that's piezoelectricity. You're putting pressure on a crystal and it creates a spark. Well, our bones and some of our collagen fibres are piezoelectric. And so we are a very crystalline structure, and our bodies actually have a characteristic more like a solid state system with as a semiconductor than the chemicals that are currently sort of focused on as being medicine. And personally, I believe that the big advances in medicine in the future will come when we start recognising that we're actually electric and start dealing with our electrical systems, as opposed to trying to just pump chemicals into us. And this is my personal comment. How can we be so arrogant? And when we are millivolts and microamps, that we can put ourselves in these very, very strong fields and voltages and not be affected, I think it's just crazy. Dr. Robert Becker, if you're interested in reading some books on this, these 3 books are superb. Very, very, very interesting. Written in the 80s. But the Body Electric, he was doing research into regeneration of cells and salamanders, and the stuff that he came up with was just amazing. I highly, highly recommend you read these if you're interested. And you know, also within our system, our heart has its own neurons in there, so we actually have a brain in our heart, and the electromagnetic field around our heart is much, much bigger than around our head. And if you're interested in reading about this, have a search for the Heart Math Solution. Very, very interesting reading. And so let's look at the actual physical things that electro-pollution do to our body. Breaches of the blood-brain barrier. We talked about that a little bit earlier on. We've known about it for more than 40 years. Dr. Leif Salford is one of the main guys that does this, and he considers it to be the world's largest uncontrolled experiment. And one of the interesting things he found was that the blood-brain barrier opens up at very, very, very low amounts of microwave radiation, 1,000th or 10,000ths of a normal cell phone call. Okay, so this is really significant. And the short-term exposure with the breaches of the blood-brain barrier have these kind of effects, genetic damage and biological effects. This is a rat's brain with a very slight albumin leakage, the dark colour down the bottom. This is very normal. This is a control, and this is after 2 hours exposure to a cell phone. And all those dark browns, all those dark spots are where the leakage in the blood-brain barrier has occurred. So this is toxins getting into the brain that should not be there. Okay, cell phones. And he found that passive exposure was more dangerous for blood-brain barrier leakage than having the phone directly at your head. So they found that 1.8 metres away from the body, or 200 metres away from a cell phone tower, was more significant than having the phone actually close to your head. So this brings the whole thing like passive smoking. We're now having passive exposure to microwave radiation. And the most at risk of this are unborn children, babies, children, and possibly if you're using speakerphone. And they also found that the damage to the brain carried on up to 50 days afterwards from a short period of exposure. And if you'd like to read or watch the YouTube video that this was taken from, very, very good also. Electromagnetic fields and leakage of the blood-brain barrier by Dr. Leif Selford. Okay, one of the other things is we get a change in melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone, and it's a critical hormone, and it's the strongest anti-cancer agent we manufacture. And most significant reduction is when you're exposed both daytime and evening or nighttime. And one test was 25% of subjects sleeping on an electric blanket had significant reduction in melatonin, just from electric blanket, not microwave radiation. And there was a distinct dose response, and a 25-minute cell phone call leads to a significant reduction. Just when you're sleeping at night, to make sure that you're manufacturing plenty of melatonin, you should be in a room that's very, very dark. You should have no lights on at all, and definitely no microwave radiation. There's some thought that the pineal gland, which produces melatonin, sees the microwave radiation more like light, and light turns off the production of melatonin. So very, very important you sleep in a very dark room, and preferably with no microwave radiation. Okay, calcium efflux and influx, this is at the cellular level, and calcium ions are really important in the firing of the neurons, and so if also development of cells, DNA. So if we are exposed, the calcium ions fled or leave and are excreted or whatever, and so this means that they leak away from the cell membranes in the cells, and the communication in the cells doesn't work correctly, and also changes brain response and behaviour, and linked to other neurological things or issues. And calcium ion influx can also happen, and that stops the normal death of the cell, the apoptosis. So, you know, we're getting two varying effects. One is we're losing calcium ions, but we can also have them being held in the cell as well. Stress response, both EMF and EMR create a stress response, and they talk about heat shock proteins, I think is the correct term for this, and or stress proteins. Sometimes stress is good for us. Short-term stress actually strengthens us, but when it's chronic, long-term, then we start having a problem because our systems become overloaded. So, and the effect of long-term stress or chronic stress is very cumulative. And so as this accumulates, or the effect accumulates, we are unable to then respond correctly to these stresses, and it overloads our system, and then we become susceptible to disease. Okay, cell membranes is another area, and I think this is one of the more critical areas where they're doing a lot of research at the moment. The exposure causes the switching of the genes on and off, and this is called the adaptive capacity. And I was talking to Dr. George Carlo, and he was saying that exposure to particularly microwave radiation, but also electromagnetic fields, stops the communication at the cellular level. And the membranes actually close down, and over time the cells learn that this is quite normal to be closed down. And this builds up, as the cellular communication stops, the free radicals build up inside the cells, which becomes toxic inside the cell, and also nutrition can't come into the cell. And so the cellular energy decreases by about 40%, and then you start getting internal structural changes, which then flow into functional changes, cascading down through the organism, and the weakest system then becomes compromised. And this is a very valid explanation why we have a myriad of diseases linked to one single source. And they're now developing some tests where we can look at that. So as I was looking at all this, the thing that fascinated me, we're talking a lot about DNA, And I don't know how much you guys know about DNA, but I thought I'd just put some facts in which are really interesting. It's very, very efficient at conducting electricity. It's the common building material that we're using in the new nano devices and molecular electronics. And the DNA molecule is almost 2 meters long. If in the cell, if you unwound DNA, it's taller than me. But when it's compressed back into the cell, it's a coiled coil. And this is what they call a fractal antenna. And it makes it very, very efficient at picking up a very wide range of frequencies. And it's far more sensitive to, DNA is far more sensitive to EMF and EMR. And when cells split to reproduce, there are many, many mistakes made, but there are mechanisms to repair that. One of the possible things is that with microwave radiation in particular, that mechanism is not working correctly and the damage carries on. Okay, so there's a lot of research about damage to DNA. I'm just kind of zinging through this because we're a little bit short on time, but the bottom one, this research was done with a laptop on somebody's lap, and what they found was that a couple of hours exposure greatly diminished both the motility and the viability of the sperm just from having a wireless laptop sitting on a guy's lap. A couple of hours. Be very careful. Now, some of the reading you guys were given, one of the other readings was Dr. Sam Milham, and I'm going to talk about some of his other research. He came up with a really interesting theory, and he wrote an interesting book called Dirty Electricity, also a very good book to read. And what he found was a distinct relationship between the introduction of electricity and what he calls the diseases of civilization. And so that's cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and suicide. And Sam Milham was one of the top epidemiologists in America. And very, very difficult now because electricity is ubiquitous, it's just everywhere. But there is one group of people that we can actually compare against in America, that's the old order Amish. You might have seen them in movies sometimes. They drive around in horse and buggy, they don't have any electricity, and they farm in a very, very old-fashioned way. Well, they have 40% less cancer. ADD, ADHD is virtually unheard of in their children. And there are a lot of other statistics that sort of indicate that the lack of electricity, AC, modern electricity, is helping to provide them with a healthier life. I mean, their rates of obesity are similar to other parts of the American population, and yet a lot of the cardiovascular and other things or indicators are a lot lower. So, out of his research, this is not in his book or published anywhere, I've extrapolated some of the figures from his paper, and what we're looking at is the blue bars are the amount of, or the percentage of electrification in the homes or dwellings, and the reddy coloured ones are electricity or electrification in a farm. And so in 1920, we started in the late 1800s, we started in New York City. By 1920, 35% of the houses in America already had electricity. Yeah, the uptake on that was fabulous, just really, really quick. And yet, very, very low percentage in farms. And as we go across, by the time we get to 1956, and the green line is a trend line, by the time we get to 1956, 99.8% of all dwellings, farm and urban, have got electricity in the USA. Now the red line is a ratio between electrified and non-electrified. So in 1920, if you lived in Massachusetts, which is a highly electrified state, as opposed to Alabama, I think it was, which had virtually no electricity at all in the farms, you were 2.21 times more liable to die of cancer. Okay, the next slide shows you how I got that, how I worked that out. So 1920, or Louisiana it was, sorry. 1920, that's the death rate per 100,000 in Massachusetts and Louisiana. And one of the main correlators is the amount of electricity that or the electrification rate. And as you can see, as the years have gone by, that ratio is, or that rate has fallen. Now there's a bit of a hiccup in the middle where World War II happened, so I think there's probably a little bit of skewing of the figures there. But what we're looking at is a constantly sloping trend line downwards, and if we carried on another 10 or 20 years, which is often the gestation period for cancer, that rate would get down to 1.1 or 1.2 or something like that. So Sam Millam's or his philosophy, or not philosophy, his research indicates that the introduction of AC electrical power has caused a lot of the diseases that we have today. And I'll go through this very quickly. This is some of the other research that Sam Millam has also done. Published a great number of papers. Okay, so next thing I want to talk about is chronic health. And I was at talking to somebody at a preschool centre the other day, and a couple of days ago, and they have an after-school program for young kids. So they're between 3:30 and 5 o'clock till the parents can come and pick them up. And unprovoked by me, the comment was made was that 80% of those children in after-school care have some chronic health issue. 80%. Now, I'm a fair bit older than all of you guys, but I can remember when I was back at school, that was not the case whatsoever. We had a couple of people with asthma maybe, but the rise in chronic conditions in children is epidemic, in my opinion, at the moment, or pandemic. It's just crazy. And one of those chronic health issues, or a health issue, is autism. And we look at this graph. In 1970, it was 1 in 10,000. In 2009, 1 in 110. 2013, it was 1 in 50 in America, kids born with autism. And it's just going exponential. And if you look at the uptake in wireless technology, that's also exponential. But one bit of research I looked at was really interesting. They said that fathers were 80% more likely to transmit DNA glitches that cause autism. Okay, so we're having a paternal thing. Then they looked at the older fathers theory, and they said, okay, fathers are older now, maybe that's a problem. Looked at the research, didn't work. Then they thought maybe it's underreporting or some other mysterious thing, couldn't find anything. And then they said, okay, if this really is something to do with our children's health, there should be other things that are happening as well. And some other research from 1995 to 2010 showed that children under 25 had a doubling of mental health disorders, whereas the adult population was less than 6%. So there is definitely things happening with our children. Autism rates increased with affluence. When autism first started coming on stream, it was the wealthy states that were getting autism, the poorer states were not. And they looked at it and thought, well, okay, what's happening here? But in the poorer states, they're more industrially polluted, so it can't be a pollution issue. And then the uptake of mobile phones was initially with the affluent. And so, okay, maybe there's some correlation with mobile phones. And this website reference down here, if you want to look at the full thing here, whyautismhappens.com. And then they started looking at the large number of studies linking cell phone radiation to sperm damage. And a French study showed massive decreases in sperm concentration in normal sperm, not linked necessarily to cell phones, but I think it's been well recognised that there's significant fertility issues coming. And then, even with slight DNA damage, we're looking at problems that are going to be widespread. Now, they looked at this a little bit further, and what they said, okay, in women, eggs are far better protected. They're behind very dense tissue. And as I've said before, carrying cell phones in a bar is not a good thing, but most women don't carry a cell phone in a pocket. They're more in a handbag or somewhere else. And so they then looked at men. And men's reproductive organs are significantly more exposed. They're very external, and a cell phone in a pocket exposes the male reproductive organs to at least 16 times more exposure, and possibly significantly more. And so I don't know if that's an issue, but one thing I would say to you as young people is, especially guys or girls as well, if you plan on having children in the future, remember this: for a period before you want, at least 30 days before you want to have children, make sure that your guy keeps his cell phone out of his pocket all the time, and you guys also keep things away from your reproductive organs for at least 30 days. For the guys, for their sperm to regenerate or whatever. And but I think this is a really serious issue, and I think it's something that's not being discussed, but I think it's very important. And as far as cell phones in the bras go, this is a YouTube video. This is an Asian lady who had no predisposition to breast cancer. She had all the genetic tests. She didn't have any of the genetic markers. Asian women apparently are a lot less susceptible to getting breast cancer, and yet those 3 marks are for 3 very, very unusual breast cancers. And this is where she carried her cell phone for a number of years. And in the same way that the boys have to be careful where the cell phones are, girls also, please, this is a really serious issue. I won't go into the full whys and wherefores of this, but I would suggest that if you haven't heard of Barry Trower and you want to do a little bit of research on this, do a YouTube search for Barry Trower. He has some really amazing videos on YouTube. This is taken from a document, Wi-Fi, a thalidomide in the making, who cares? And what he's talking about in this document is that it's not until the 3rd generation that we're actually really going to know what damage we've done to our children. So, and this is where a lot of people are talking about this being an uncontrolled experiment. The damage that's being done to fetuses, and for the first, I was looking here, for the first 100 days or something, or for a very long period of time, all of the organs are on the outside of a fetus, and so the woman might not know she's pregnant. Sitting with a laptop on your lap or cell phone, tablet, that kind of exposure to an unborn child can be really extreme. There's no protection whatsoever. And if DNA damage is done in the 1st generation, it's not until 2 generations later that potentially we're going to see that. And these are a couple of quotes from, I think it's a different thing, but you can read them. But basically what he's saying is that the damage that we do to our unborn children now is something that's going to carry on until the end of your family line. This is how critical and how serious this is at the moment, is that any genetic damage that has been done to unborn children, or children, a couple of generations on, we're going to see the effect, but that's just going to carry on forever. So, very, very important. Now, talking about you guys, actually, this was taken from another presentation I gave on Wi-Fi in schools. But this is the kind of research on how much you guys are using digital devices. 75% of 25 to 29-year-olds take their phones to bed. It's a bit of a sad state, really, isn't it? And looking at Wi-Fi, this is looking at kids at high school. 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 4 terms a year, that's about 12,000 hours per year of exposure of Wi-Fi over normal school life over 10 years. And over 10 years we reached 12,000 hours exposure. Now the Interphone study, which is a very, very flawed study, and I have to say there is no research whatsoever done on Wi-Fi in children. There is none, as far as I'm aware. So the only thing we can do is look to some of the cell phone studies, and what they were finding was that there was a significant increase in brain tumours if you used a cell phone for more than 10 years, and over that time you had a cumulative time of 1,640 hours, which is basically 27 minutes a day. Okay, so at that time they were classing somebody who used the phone for 10 minutes a day as a heavy phone user. This research was done a number of years ago. So, the amount that you guys use the phones these days is significantly more. You have to be careful. Okay, and children, young children absorb a lot more microwave radiation. So this is looking at comparison of how much is absorbed by a 5 and 10-year-old and an adult. And you can see that the skull is a lot thinner, and at the same time, a child, when they're growing, there's so many more cells that are being created, this whole growth process, and it's when those cells separate that the damage can be done to the DNA. And we've got this massive amount of growth in the brain. But I went to a lecture at my son's college the other day, and they were saying that the first 3 years are the most critical. and for creating all kinds of social skills and learning and everything. And at that period, our young children, the amount of absorption in their brains is huge. And so, again, around babies, young children, please be very, very careful with this stuff. Okay, so in our digital environment, there's a number of effects that have been noted on children. And first is a negative effect on brain growth. And again, in that very early period, there's a number of research showing that exposure to microwave radiation has a very, very significantly negative effect. Cognitive delays, impaired learning, and also delayed development. And where kids are using the stuff, we're seeing kids now 2-3 years old sitting down with iPads. I regularly, if I go out to dinner, I'll regularly see if there's a family there, there's often, if there's 2 kids, there'll be 2 iPads, and they'll just sit there and quiet as anything. There's no movement happening whatsoever. And so, parents giving iPhones to babies in teething cases, shocking. And okay, young kids seem to be amazing. They can just pick this up and use it. It seems to be wired in, but at the same time, they're not getting up and running around, or they're not playing. And so this reduced movement is delaying development. Mental illnesses from this, there's a whole lot of anxiety disorders, attachment disorders. If you get a 3 or 4 year old and say you're going to take away their iPad, watch what happens. I mean, that's way worse than taking them through the checkout aisle that's got sweets. I mean, this is really, there's a lot of stuff happening with the attachment children are getting to this stuff. Obesity, sitting and watching TV, playing video games. Sleep deprivation, and young people are, cell phones under the pillow, or parents are giving them access to internet in their bedrooms. And they're not getting sufficient sleep. Looking at playing violent games, looking at violent media. There's all kinds of sexual stuff on the internet. This is breeding a whole different level of aggression in our children, and not learning that there are consequences. Digital dementia. Okay, so again, it's so focused on these electronic devices, we're not allowing our kids' brains to develop correctly. And addictions. This one study is talking about 1 in 11 children. This next study I'm going to go through here was 1 in 4 actually. It was from, I think it was 1 in 4. But the students in the study constantly talked about being addicted to their devices. They felt like they were an extension of their devices. They said that they felt lost or really lonely if they had their screens taken away, and had no idea what to do. And I mean, I can recall this even with our son. Was that he'd be watching the TV, and you turn off the TV, it's like, oh, what do I do? I don't know what to do. I don't know if you guys can relate to that, but this is the kind of stuff that we're getting from this research. And I don't know if this cartoon sort of resonates with anybody. I think you might need to be a parent to really get this one, but there's just a real change happening in the psychology of our children. And I kind of found this, I thought it was kind of funny. And we're getting pretty close to the end now, so I'm a bit of a car nut. And so I wanted to try and have some relatable analogy of where we are with this technology at the moment. And if we look at that car, it's about a 1910, somewhere around about there. And if you look closely, it doesn't have any front brakes. There is some attempt to have some safety devices. There's an old squeezy bulb horn. There's a bit of a windscreen, but there's no windscreen wipers or anything like that. And the headlights on the front are probably carbide, and they probably wouldn't illuminate anything at all. You wouldn't be able to see where you're going. But the design impetus into this car has been to make it bigger, better, faster, stronger. And that's what you see there. That thing, it's quite big, quite strong, and would actually go quite fast. Now, if you hit something with this car, the driver's probably going to be impaled on the steering wheel, and you're going to do a lot of damage either to the people in the car or the people you hit. Now, I think that's where we are at with this technology. The engineers that are designing the technology we have right now, it's just constantly, how can we make it faster and better? What can we do with it? Where can we go with it? How can we make it, so much better? But look at a car today. What happened was in the 50s and 60s, we began to recognise that there was risk in driving a vehicle. And today we're even more risk averse. And we have airbags, we've got safety belts, we've got crumple zones, we've got side intrusion bars, we've got all these electronics built into the car so that we don't have anti-skid, we've got anti-skid systems and things like that. And so we've got all of this technology put into the vehicles. We fully recognise that driving a car is a risky thing to do, but we've tried to mitigate that risk. So where I think we're at is somewhere in between in these two stages of evolution of technology with our electronic or digital technology. We're going hell for leather to make this stuff go as fast as we can, but until we begin to recognise that there is risk, and this has to come from governments, they've got to say, yes, our standards are too high, we've got to make them more human, biologically friendly. Until we start putting an acknowledgement of risk and telling our engineers and the people developing this to be aware of the people aspect of this, we're not going to have a significant change. But I firmly believe that we can make a real difference to this technology, and we can make it far, far safer. I mean, I'm not against technology. There's no way we can get rid of it, but I think we can make it a lot safer. These are some of the books that I've read, which if you're interested in reading some good books, these are really good. Overpowered by Martin Blank came out this year. Very, very, very good book. Disconnect by Deborah Davis has been around for quite a long time, but it really is an expose on what's happened in the cell phone industry and how we've got to where we've got to. Really interesting. All of the other ones are really good. The Force by Lynn McLean is a very good informational book about what electro-pollution is, but also what you can do about it. Take Back Your Power is a very good movie, and also Microwave Science and Lies. Both very, very, very good movies. Some web references. You can look at my website is safespace.net.nz. On the resources and info pages, there's a lot of links to videos and documents you can download. So that's me. And so thank you. And